watching on the live stream. So it's such a pleasure to have been asked to moderate this panel between these two wonderful authors whose books have really quite a lot in common, so I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. I'll just do a very brief intro to the authors. As you know, their bios are on the website, but I will just very briefly introduce them. Then I'll ask them each to say a little bit about their books by way of introduction, and then a short reading from each of them before we launch into the discussion. So Sarah. Sarah was raised in Nigeria and has lived in Kenya, France, and England. She holds a PhD from the University of California and teaches literature at San Francisco State University. Her first novel, Independence, was published by Legend Press in London, Cassava Republic in Abuja, and Weaver Press in Harare. Sarah sits on the boards of Hedgebrook and San Francisco's Museum of the African Diaspora, and she was the chair of judges for the Etisalat Prize in 2015. And very recently, just last month, Like a Mule, Sarah's second novel, was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize. This is a prize, a very prestigious prize in the UK, founded in 2013, which celebrates innovation in the novel. So that's Sarah. Welcome, Sarah. And Yewande was born in Barbados and grew up in Nigeria, moving to South Africa with her family in 1992. She's the author of Bomboy, published in South Africa in 2011. In 2012, she won the South African Literary Award for First-Time Published Author and was shortlisted for the South African Sunday Times Fiction Prize. In 2013, she was a finalist in the inaugural Pan-African Etisalat Fiction Prize, of which Sarah was the judge. She lives in Johannesburg, where she writes and has her own architectural practice. Welcome, Yewande. So we're just going to start. I'll ask Yewande first to do just a very brief intro to your book, so those that haven't read it have a little bit of an idea what's going on, and then a short reading. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you to everybody who's here, who woke up for this session after the revelry last night, no doubt. So thanks for being here, and it's really great to be on the panel with you, Sarah. An introduction to the book. I like to think of the book as the story of a hate-ship between two octogenarian neighbors, two women in their 80s who hate one another. The story deals with various things. It deals with being in the last years of life. It also deals with race. One of the women is South African and Jewish. One of the women is from the Caribbean and black. And there's a way in which Hortensia, who is the woman from Barbados, really sticks it to Marion, her neighbor, and shows her up and puts a mirror up to her racism. So I wanted to write about, on the one hand, a racist white South African, and I enjoyed that because I think there's a way in which we all know South Africa's history, but it's very hard to find anyone in South Africa who actually supported apartheid, although we realize that there must have been a few, which is why it lasted so long. But I mean, I say that jokingly, but I also wanted to say that it's important that we can own up to that as a country, as a nation, because otherwise we're always stuck in a loop. And so I wanted to look at a racist person and attempt to understand how she rationalizes the way she sets up her world, and that's the character of Marion. I also wanted to look at privilege. These two women are incredibly wealthy, and they have interesting relationships with their domestic help, so I wanted to look at class as well. And they're equally nasty, just by the way. Hortensia does not get away with having the moral, the moral upper hand on Marion. They're both incredibly flawed characters. And so essentially that's the story. What happens is they hate one another, and at some point in the story, they need one another. And so I also asked the question, can we reconcile, however late? And can such disparate groups, people, personalities reconcile? The reading, okay. Yeah, so I'm reading from page 6, and I'm just reading a short section, which is the first time that the two women interact. Once a month, a Catherine committee meeting was held. As far as Hortensia understood it, the committee had been started by a woman named Marian Agostino, who also happened to be her neighbor, a nasty woman who Hortensia did not like. But then again, Hortensia did not like most people. She had stumbled upon the meetings by accident, soon after she arrived in Catherine. No one had thought to mention that by rights, as an owner, she was entitled to while away time with the other committee members. The information was let slip. At the time, Hortensia had felt that the initial omission was not forgetfulness, but deliberate, and it was easy enough to assume that the slight was based on skin color. Armed with the knowledge, Hortensia had taken the short trip to Marian's and pressed the buzzer on her intercom. "It's Hortensia James from next door." She had not been offended by the absence of any show of welcome from her neighbor or the other residents. They had not come to Catherine to make friends, something both she and Peter had done without for the bulk of their lives. "Wait, I'll call my madame," a disembodied voice said. Hortensia leaned her shoulder against the wall. "Hello?" That must be Marian. "It's Hortensia from next door." "Yes." This was the moment when Hortensia understood she would not be invited in. The slight annoyed her briefly, but she waved it away as unimportant. "I'll be attending the meetings." It mustn't sound like she's asking permission. "The committee meetings." "I hadn't realized you were owners." Hortensia, still listening at the buzzer like a beggar. "Yes, well, we are." "Oh, well, I was confused." And Hortensia could almost hear Marian searching for another gear. "Is that gentleman your husband?" She wasn't asking so much as scolding. "Who, Peter?" "Yes." Again, this hadn't surprised Hortensia. She'd fallen in love with a white man in 1950s London. They had been asked on many occasions to verify their courtship, to affirm that they were attached, to validate their love. Within a year of being together, they were practiced at it. "Yes, Peter is my husband." "I see." In the silence, Hortensia supposed Marian was thinking, inching towards her next move, preparing another strike, but instead she heard a sigh and almost missed the details of the upcoming meeting. Marian even threw in a dress code as a parting gift. "We dress for our meetings, Mrs. James. We follow rigorous decorum," as if she thought dignity was something Hortensia required schooling in. The meetings seemed to have been created for the purpose of policing the neighborhood, keeping an eye out for the elements. The community librarian had explained to Hortensia foolishness, Hortensia had thought, and soon been vindicated after attending a few sessions. The meetings were a show of a significance that did not exist. Old women with their wigs, their painted nails, their lipsticks seeping down whistle lines, scared and old, rich white women pretending in the larger scheme of life that they were important. Hortensia attended because the women were amusing, nattering on in earnest about matters that didn't matter. She enjoyed to think she was laughing at them, but really it passed the time, took her mind off whatever else there was. There were times, however, when the meetings moved from amusing to offensive. Once, a black couple moved into Catherine, renting a duplex not on the avenue, but off one of the minor roads. They had 2 children. A neighbor, an old man, green at the gills and one-toothed, complained that the children ought not to bother his postbox. The matter was raised in committee. He claimed that the children were assaulting his postbox, messing with it. How did he know this? Had he seen it? No, he had smelt it when he climbed down his stoop to collect the mail. He knew the smell of brown children. Could this botheration come to an end, he pleaded. Hortensia had cursed him and walked out of that meeting. And as if the heavens had heard the man's plea, the botheration came to an end. He died.
Thank you, and it's a wonderful introduction to your book, and I think you depict that circle of those women so well. There's a line just in the next page, which was one of my favourites, where the women are together, they're told something, and a shiver went round, scented in a bouquet of Yardley, Anay, and talcum powder. And I love the way you really conjure up the sort of the smells and the sort of sense of this room as well as the women there.
Thank you.
Sarah, so would you like to tell us a little bit about Like a Mule and then a short reading, please?
Well, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here, and it's really fantastic to be on a panel with Yewande, whose work I've enjoyed over the last few years. So the novel that I've just written is a novel entitled Like a Mule, Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, the longest title for the shortest book. And it's a story of a almost 75-year-old Nigerian woman living in America. So she's an expat in America. She's not an immigrant. You know how it's interesting how words change. So she's an expat in America, and the book is about her life. It's her story. She led a very fancy life as a diplomat's wife in years earlier, and now she's living a somewhat lonelier life in San Francisco. It's also the story of her unlikely friendships in San Francisco, and she has all sorts of friends ranging from shopkeepers to a homeless character that I'm going to do a little reading from. So I think, two things I want to say about this book. I'm very interested in identity, in the way that we perceive ourselves, the way we see ourselves, and the way that others see us. So in the reading that I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce you to my main character just briefly, and then I'm going to introduce you to this homeless character who sees my main character and who sees her in a particular light. I'm really interested in going deep, going beneath the skin, as it were, and looking at our humanity, what unites us over things that may appear to be differences. Okay, so I'm going to stand, and those who did the workshop session with me will have heard a little bit of this. One thing that I said to the people who took the workshop was that I have found that actually trying to step into the shoes of my characters helps me to get deeper into the characters. So I think I know my lines. I'm going to be giving you some lines from chapter 3 and chapter 6, but if I forget them, I'll turn around quickly, or someone who's read the book can prompt me and tell me what comes next. Okay. So starting with my main character. You know, I must have walked several blocks before noticing the homeless man in front of me. And when I noticed how dejectedly he was walking, I felt so bad. You know, on the man's backpack was a tangle of straps and flaps, just flapping angrily in the wind. And when the man stopped with his dog, I passed discreetly around both of them, keeping my distance in case of lice or some sudden outburst. I was expecting the man to smell badly, but he didn't. And when I turned around and looked again, I saw that he was not a he, but a she, and shockingly young to be carrying such a heavy load. You know, judging from the slenderness of her arms, maybe she was 17 or 18. But when I looked again, and I saw those steely blue eyes, I was no longer sure. Maybe she was in her 30s or her 40s. Anyway, she seemed really agitated with her dog. She was shouting at her dog, you know? So I said to her, Are you okay? My darling. All right, so the other day, this black lady comes up to me, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I know what y'all are thinking about America, that we're all racist and stuff like that. I'm just saying she was black, and she was tall and old. I mean, not old, but like old enough to be my mom or my grandma. Anyway, she sees I'm carrying all this shit. Plus, I had my dog with me. So I guess she just kind of felt sorry for me. But sometimes you get tired of people looking at you like you need pity and shit like that. Yeah, I'm homeless, but so what? Homeless is just because I'm house challenged. I don't have a roof over my head, but I make it work. And thank God that I work in the food industry, because I feel like I've learned a lot from living like that. Because you never starve, you're always clothed, we ground score everything. I mean, basically, you know, and I know people, and I go to a lot of people's parks, and I see a lot of it there. No one's better or different than anyone else. We're all of one heart. We all care for each other. We all look after each other, stuff like that. And I don't do drugs or do anything like that anymore, and I don't drink or do anything like that anymore, and that's a choice. That's a perspective that I have. To respect. R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Find out what that means to me. Respect myself. Because you can't live like this if you're high all the time. You just be tired and you lose focus. You know? And I'm okay. Have my dog. Have my car. Have my job. And I was married. Lived in Oakland. Lived in Portland. Lived in Berkeley. And I had a really good childhood and stuff, you know? My dad earned a lot of money back then living in the Bronx. What people earn today, my dad earned back then. Those kind of figures, you know? So I come from good stock. My dad was a saver, whereas I'm not. I'm more of an artist, free spirit, stuff like that. You know, we had a piano growing up. My grandmother had a piano and ukuleles and mandolins and stuff like that. And that's how come that gave me that free spirited danceability, you know, like the Grateful Dead, and I did modern dance. And I had a recital at Carnegie Hall and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that I'm a poor little rich white girl or anything. I'm not saying that. Sure, I have a higher sight for myself. But then I just want to take everyone in my home, you know, and give them a good night's rest. Because I know what it's like. I haven't slept in a bed for 3 years. But that's like, well, it's like a journey in life, like a journalist going to another country, or like a missionary going on a mission, something like that, you know? It's not to say that I don't sleep. I mean, I have a comforter, I have a pillow, had a sleeping bag, I gave that away. Giving, it's so good to give. You know, buying someone a cup of coffee or someone doing that for you, that kind of thing. That act of kindness is amazing. Amazing, you know? Because sometimes I think we just don't take the time to get to know people as people, you know? And just like to backpedal to that black woman I was talking about, well, maybe her heart was broken. And I shouldn't have been so like, I don't want to talk to you. We just never know. Be kind. Be kind.
Fabulous, Sarah. Thank you so much. So I think you've really given us a taste of the humour in the book. And you know, lots of the reviews I think have talked about how uplifting it is, and it really is a sort of very, very humorous take on old age in some ways. And this wonderful character Sage, you know, where she's not homeless, she's house challenged, and you know, she's wonderful sort of spots of light relief within the novel.
Can I just add, she's my favorite character in that book. It's really such an incredible voice. Yeah.
Yeah, and she, well, you really made her come alive just then, so thank you for that. So I'd like to start by, by Sarah, just saying that when your book was nominated for the Goldsmiths Prize, one of the judges, Bernardine Evaristo, commented that a fiction about a septuagenarian black woman is almost completely uncharted territory in British literature. And I think we could extend that to say not just British literature, but literature in general. And yet here in this book chat, we have two wonderful novels about not just two older women, but three. Yewande, you really have two protagonists in your novel. Yours on the cusp of 75, and your characters Hortensia and Marion in their 80s. So I'd just like to start by asking you both what prompted you to write novels about older women. And Sarah, I'll start with you, please.
Well, I think when I'm writing fiction, I'm often drawn to stories that I want to read, but I'm not finding. And many of you will have heard that Toni Morrison said something similar, that if you want to read a story and you can't find it, then write it. And I was finding that I really wanted to read stories of older women. I was finding lots of stories about older men, Ian McEwan, J.M. Coetzee, Philip Roth, etc., but not so many about older women, and certainly almost none, before Yewande came along, about older women of color and African women. And so that's what drove me to explore this.
From my side, it was also quite personal. I spent some time with my grandmother some years back. We just lost my grandfather, and I was with her, and she was in mourning, and she got married when she was 17, and they'd been married for decades and decades. And I was just kind of observing her and also understanding that she was in the last years of her life, and it made me think about what that's like. So I suppose I came to it out of a curiosity as to what it's like to have the bulk of your life behind you. Obviously, death is something that meets us at any point of life, but I was just particularly interested in that kind of death that comes at the end of a really long life. And Hortensia is not my grandmother. My grandmother was a lot sweeter, but I did then go on from there and think, well, what would it be like to be at the end of your life? And in particular, the life you'd lived was a miserable one, was one that wasn't fulfilling, was one that you were bitter about. I thought that would even compound the sense of time lost and not much left to correct or to redeem. So that was really a starting point for the story.
And I think for me that's really one of the most powerful things about the novel, this bitterness and this hate, which is just so tangible. And as we learn more about Hortensia, we see where it comes from. But by contrast, Sarah, your character Morayo, she doesn't have that at all. She's also had a troubled life, but she's very proactively going out, trying to interact with as many people as she can. Do you want to just tell us a bit about why you chose to write it in that uplifting way, whereas perhaps when one thinks about older women, that might not be our preconceptions?
Well, I think, I want to add to what I said about not finding stories about older women and say that in real life I was meeting these incredible women, as Yewande is talking about her grandmother. And I think there was also a part of me that maybe subconsciously was driven to write a story that went counter to the prevailing narrative in, I was going to say America, but it's really a prevailing global narrative, which is one of a fear of the other, be that a fear of someone from a different religion, a fear of someone with a different sexuality, a fear of someone from a different culture, and so forth. And I really wanted to show also what I was seeing, that you can have Morayo, this Nigerian woman living in San Francisco, who becomes friends with a Jewish, homeless, white woman in San Francisco. And there is sweetness, ice cream, in the relationships that we can have across what's often suggested to be barriers between people.
And I think this idea of identity, because I think all three of these main characters, we have Morayo, Nigerian, living in San Francisco, and equally she's travelled around the world with her diplomat husband. And then Hortensia from Barbados, living in South Africa. And even Marion, who you describe obviously as South African, but she has roots in Lithuania, and there's a very poignant part where she talks about her own parents leaving Europe. This, for me, has something this is not a coincidence that these characters struggle in this way. Why do you, so Marion, for example, why did you give her that background? Because equally she could have just been somebody with several generations, a white South African.
Yeah, so there were many reasons. Also, just to preempt the answer by saying sometimes it's not premeditated, but something comes as an image or an idea, and then you layer over it and work it up a bit. So I can't always take credit, in the sense that sometimes it just, oh yeah, that seems right. But then I interrogate the idea. So the idea to have her be, for instance, Jewish and have her parents have come from Nazi Germany or from Lithuania, and which is a huge part of South Africa's history, is the Jewish population and the number of Jews that settled in South Africa as they were fleeing for their lives, leaving their families behind, losing people. It's a huge part of our history in South Africa, and also a part of the struggle and the history of the struggle in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid. Many of the white South Africans that were part of that struggle, visibly and actively part of the struggle, whether it was Umkhonto we Sizwe or any other movements that were part of the struggle, were Jewish. So there's also this legacy of Jewish people struggling with black South Africans against apartheid. So I just thought it would be troublesome to have a racist Jew, and I'm not trying to be, but I wanted to be troublesome a bit with the story. I wanted to look at race and racism. I wanted there to be irony. I wanted Marion to be someone that it's ironic with the history she has and the history her family had to be racist and justify that racism, because I think that's more interesting than, and a friend of mine who happens to be Jewish, who read the book when it was still in manuscript stage, did say to me, you do realize that we have a history of Jewish people in the struggle, and that this is really counter to that. And I said, yes, and that's deliberate.
And this fear of the other that Sarah talks about is very much there with Marion and her group of her close octogenarians in this very small, close-knit, closed community. I was also interested, the root of Hortensia's bitterness and her failed marriage is very much tracked back to the affair that her husband has. And he has an affair with a white woman. So Peter, as you said, was, as Hortensia describes him, a white man she fell in love with in 1950s London. They then moved to South Africa, and he has this affair, and it's with a white woman. If he'd have had an affair with a black woman, would that have had a different impact on Hortensia? Tell us a little bit about your choice for that.
Yeah, okay. When I imagined the character of the woman he has an affair with, she was always white. And I don't know, I could probably sit on a couch with a therapist and we could work out why I would only imagine her as white. But I couldn't quite imagine her as black, and I don't think that's the story. I think that's me and what I can and can't imagine. And I think that's something that writers don't often talk about. What are we able to imagine? What aren't we? I could only ever imagine her as that. At the same time, her race isn't mentioned. Hortensia's bitterness isn't, my goodness, you did it with a white woman. That's not Hortensia's bitterness. Hortensia's bitterness is the betrayal of love.
Well, there's this passage which, for me, Peter and the girls stood kissing, oblivious as only white lovers in Bangor Market could be. So for me, I'm really interested in that because, Hortensia, and she really, she actively follows them, and these several scenes where she's torturing herself, isn't she? Looking at this couple, but not to labour the point, but I think it's, for me, it jumped out a little bit.
No, it's good you mention it, and not a lot of people do, so I'm glad you do, because it's perhaps it's an uncomfortable detail for some people, perhaps, so they don't often talk about that. I don't have a clever answer, I just know that that's how I imagined her. I have my own Yewande answer that isn't very writerly, which is that somehow if she were, this is more politics now but that somehow if she were a black woman, it will be more complex for me in the writing. Like I would have had to just deal with other things. I don't know, that's how I felt. So somehow I could just kind of make her, you know, she's an ex, she comes to visit. The affair actually happens in Nigeria because they travel around with his work. And she's a visiting, you know, British woman, and they meet. And I could also understand if he's lonely, he meets somebody from home. You know, there's a way that story can just pass without me laboring it too much. And I felt it got a little bit more off what I was trying to do with the novel if she were black. But I didn't think too much about it. I just kind of trusted that's who the character was.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then Sarah, in your novel, so Mariah, who for me is a character with more agency than Hortensia, and I think in many ways perhaps Mariah, the reason you're able to write this more uplifting story is that your protagonist, she does have agency. You know, she actually has an affair of her own, and ultimately she leaves the marriage herself, where, you know, we'll perhaps talk about this a little bit later, the reasons why Hortensia stays. But equally, you also do your novel. I mean, although it's about Mariah, it's about so many other characters as well. You know, this character Sage and many others also have really quite main roles. And the character of Reggie, who we meet towards the end of the novel, is a character I think we haven't talked about very much in perhaps some of your other chats. But he also has a mixed race marriage with his wife, and there's quite a poignant bit there where they're in the old people's home, and his wife, who has Alzheimer's, or, you know, she's losing her faculties. Somebody makes a comment, and he really has quite they make a racist comment. It's very, very open, and he really has quite a reaction to this. And that because it's such a subtle novel in so many ways, that bit for me again jumped out because it's, you know, it's very stated. Just tell us a little bit about that scene.
Well, I'll come to Reggie in a moment, but I want to say something about Mariah being uplifting, her story being uplifting and her having agency. This is true to a certain extent, but I think there's a fair bit of loneliness, and she has lots of conversations with her books. So her books are truly her best friends, and so I think there's also that element. But the character of Reggie, he originally comes from the Caribbean, and he's married a white American woman, and his wife is in an elderly home, and he doesn't live in the elderly home with her, but he visits her. And, you know, one of the things I was really interested in exploring in this book was how do we age? And how do we age in cultures that are not necessarily the cultures from which we come? And I was also interested in in dementia, which is very, very depressing. And I have older friends, two of whom I've seen go through dementia, very difficult. And so I think through his character, I was exploring what is it like, to a small extent, to have a partner who is losing her mind. And what does this do for your relationship with her? And yeah, I insert that. It's not a lot, but it's certainly something that's important. And then also the issue of race. You know, I am very interested in these public spaces where all of a sudden, like when you're a child and you're thrown into school and you're with all sorts of children from different backgrounds and so forth, in Europe and America, in these elderly homes, sometimes the same thing sort of happens, and you're all of a sudden, maybe you've grown up in just a white neighborhood or a black neighborhood, and then all of a sudden you're with new people that you don't know. And I was finishing this book at a time in America, I live in America now, where there were, seems like every day, and this continues, there's a shooting of a black man or woman. And so to a small extent, I wanted to play that out in the elderly home, think about how characters' perceptions of the other, their reaction to another black person, and how my character would respond.
You touched there on Mariah seeking her friendship with books, and she does seek solace in her books, and when she has some time, she even sort of reinvents endings for her favourite books. I mean, it's wonderful, her sort of interaction with what she really feels are sort of people in her lives. And it struck me with Hortensia, as I was thinking, this is one of sort of Mariah's techniques of, keeping herself occupied and inventing friends. Where does Hortensia seek solace? I mean, for me, I just couldn't think where that was, and I wonder if that's part of her being so bitter. Yeah.
I mean, I think it is, and I think that I deliberately wanted to look at a difficult person and a difficult personality, and then work backwards to understand, well, how did she get there, and is there any space for us to have compassion for her, because we are all flawed in some way or other. In her later years, and as her husband is dying, she starts walking, and that's really how the novel starts, with her walking. And the walking, I think, becomes her solace, and the walking is a way for her to be in motion, but to remember. And she talks about shouting at the trees and stamping the ants. This is a woman with rage, that has mostly been bottled in, or has. Not really, because she's very nasty to people, so she shoots out. But the bitterness and the sense of betrayal is what's there. And the fact that she stayed. And I deliberately wanted to look at somebody who stays, who is unhappy in a marriage and stays. And he stays as well, because neither of them leave. And I don't necessarily want to just say, it means she doesn't have agency. She's not a victim. At least not in that sense. No, I don't see her as that. She's someone who decides that she'll stay and suffer, and she will stare down life, and she will become meaner and meaner, and she'll survive everybody, and she does. Peter goes first.
Yeah. And actually, we become more aware of the sort of complication of her bitterness, because, at one point you make it very clear that, after witnessing this infidelity of her husband, at the age of 31, Hortensia James started to hate. I mean, it's very clear, you're being very explicit with the reader, that's the nub of it. But then we later learn that she was, and there's also a huge issue here, there's so many themes to discuss.
Spoiler alert.
But
Sounds like spoiler alert.
Can I talk about it? Because I think it's...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that motherhood is a big theme of both of these novels. We have Mariah, who doesn't have children. We have Marion, who does have 4 children, but is, as she regards herself, a failed mother. And then we have Hortensia, who we learn has been pregnant, but her very first pregnancy, she had an abortion. We don't know if it's not made explicit whether the cause of her later being she conceives but is unable to keep children, and her uterus, as we learn, is misshapen. But therefore it becomes complicated that this blame, she also blames herself, which I think is a much more complicated she becomes a more complicated character, and I think that does help us to empathise with her to some degree. Can you just talk a little bit about that motherhood part of Hortensia?
I think motherhood in general really is something that fascinates me for some reason, because I'm working on something new, and again, motherhood is present. And in particular, what I find interesting is how pinched motherhood is, in society, in the way we present motherhood. So mothers are soft and kind and warm, but mothers are never angry and jealous and vengeful, and that wouldn't be motherhood, that would be non-motherhood. Do you know what I mean? So motherhood is never robust enough to actually encompass all the emotions that the human being is capable of, and I think that's problematic. And so I'm always looking at motherhood, and I wanted, with these 2 women, both of them are mothers, but I'm sorry, but one is a mother, one isn't, but both are don't really derive any pleasure or joy. Right? So this idea of choose not to, or choose to, or are able to, or are not able to, but that it isn't as easy as that.
And certainly, if your character, also Marion, the other main character in your book, we learn, she's had 4 children in really quite close succession, and she makes these big sacrifices. She's 26, she's established this business. She's a successful architect, and then she, in many ways, chooses her career over her children. So by the time she's now in her 80s, she has a relationship with her daughter, but she's estranged from the other three. So, it is very complicated. And then with Mariah, and in fact, as we learn with Peter, the fact that actually they have children with children with other women, again, I think complicates that further. We learned that Mariah's husband was previously married, a fact that Mariah herself didn't know. And so we talked about this the other day, but there's this really wonderful passage in your book where we're talking about the lovemaking between Mariah and her ambassador husband, which I'd just like to read. I'd been married to Caesar for several years before he told me that my way of making love was motherly. Motherly. Of all the words he could have chosen, it hit me in the gut, right there in the uterus. Just tell us a little bit about that, Sarah.
Well, I think in a way, even without reading the book, you'll get a sense of what was going on. So she didn't have children, and she wanted to have children, and so for your husband to turn and say, your way of making love is motherly, isn't actually, well, it's particularly hard for her because she has wanted to have children. But the theme of motherhood is interesting, and I think my character doesn't have children, but she sees many of her students in a way as her de facto children, and the theme of friendship is something that runs through my book. So I think it's also, just as you're talking, it's also interesting to consider the way that various characters mother other characters, the way that women sort of will often hold each other and try and lift each other up and mother them, even if they're not technically real mothers.
I'm very conscious of time. We've only got 20 minutes, so I'll just ask a couple of things. I just want to talk about style in both of your books. There's no straight narrative in either book, and in fact, in many ways, that's a real parallel across the novels. In your book, Sarah, we have multiple viewpoints, more than in Yowande's, but nevertheless, for Mariah, if we take her story, much of it is told through flashbacks. And similarly, Yowande, yours absolutely is told in that way. Could you just briefly talk about your choice of structuring the novel in that way? Yowande first, and then Sarah.
So I don't, and again, might be unsatisfactory, but I don't know how much choice it was. I think a lot of, for me, I try and sit and write. Do you know what I mean? Like sit and write and see what comes. And also, I suppose my process for writing is very choppy, and so it's never linear anyway. Like I have a scene and it's at the end, or it belongs in the beginning, or do you know what I mean? So it's not in order. And but I think I'm particularly interested in this way of telling stories in general, rather than this story in particular needed to be told in that way. I think there's something appealing about fragments and about jumbled up time, because we have this illusion of linear. I think we live that way, and we have this kind of sense that everything's linear, and I don't think it's that simple, and I like the confusion that this causes.
And Sarah?
So as I said earlier, I was really interested in both portraying the way that we see ourselves as a character and the way that others see us. So the back and forth for me is you get to see the way that Mariah sees herself, but you see the way that others see her as well. And I will say that I wrote the book initially in the third person. So there was no first person. And then really towards the end of the completion of the book, I remember just sort of reading a bit out loud, and I think it was probably Sage, who's like, all right, you want to really tell my story? I want you to tell me in the first person, because I am not doing the third person. And, there were other characters who are like, we want, I guess this is the other thing for me, that I'm really interested in characters who are often invisible. So, the women cleaning the bathrooms here, maids, drivers, homeless people, old people. And these are people that often don't have voice. And so, like, my characters revolted at the end and said, enough of the third person, let us have voice.
So we'll just open up for questions in just 1 second. I just want to just ask Yewande just one more thing about your novel. There's this sort of reconciliation in your novel, and Hortensia, who's been this very, very, very bitter character, does, and Marion as well. They do mellow to some degree, and I just wonder. I mean, I believed it, but I just wonder really if by the time you're in your 80s. How much are you really going to change? Did you struggle with that, or was it always clear for you that you were going to end up in this way?
I mean, I don't know if I totally agree. They don't turn around and suddenly become sweet people.
There's a scene where Marion is doing Hortensia's hair.
Yes.
There's moments of extreme tenderness there.
Yes, it is. But I think what's important is that scene is very short, and it ends. Hortensia takes the comb back. I think, and I'm not kidding, I think details like that are important. Yeah. And why I'm saying that is because so that you don't get the wrong impression. Because I had to work really hard to attempt to suggest that it is vaguely possible. I don't think I suggest that it is definite and easy. I hope anyway, and maybe that's the feedback to get, but I put those details in deliberately because I'm trying to put side by side sweetness and harshness and saying these are really tough women, but they're attempting to love each other. And it's difficult and it's jarring, and sometimes they hug, but they end up stabbing each other because that's it's like, what's that story with the person crossing the crocodile and somebody crossing the river? And your nature is to eat the meat, so the squirrel gets eaten or whatever. I'm changing animals. But it's this thing of nature. So fine, yes, they are in their 80s and there is a nature that is there, but they're both these crocodiles trying to hug. And I wanted to attempt to show that. And I don't really care if people find it believable. I think that's important that I attempted to, and I worked quite hard to. Yeah.
Great. So we've just got 10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, because we started a bit late. So if we got the roving mic, great. There's a question here, please. And could you just introduce just your name and then a short question, please?
Okay, I'm Ugbu Godwin Ikechukwu. I'm interested in characterization. How was it easy for both of you to sort of get into this older women mode, to really tell their stories believably? And I think Emma asked a little bit of this. What have you both learned from writing these characters on how to live when you get to that age? Thank you.
Sarah first.
Well, there are various points when I was writing this book that I just wanted to put it down. And every time I wanted to put it down and just say, okay, this is another book that I shelve, I would meet another incredible older woman. So one of the incredible older women that I met was my neighbor, who was in her 80s. And my father happened to be visiting. My father's in his 70s. And she saw him and she said to me, honey, is your dad single? And I remember, when I was writing the book later, and I felt she's a jazz singer, and she's very, she's American, but I met this equivalent in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe. I have a Tete in Zimbabwe who's 94, and she's, always winking at me and saying, when's the next baby? And I shall be saying that till I'm 99, I'm sure. So just, in answer to your question, observing women and, asking questions, what's it like sexually in your older age? Just asking questions and listening was how I learned a little bit more. And, every year goes by, I get closer to that age myself.
And you, Wendy?
Yeah, with me, I did attempt to channel the older women I've been lucky to know and have in my life, and so there was that, and research, and I would spend some time interviewing old people in general. I spent some time at a Jewish old age home in Cape Town, just sitting and talking. And then also imagination. I mean, I think that's important, that this is fiction. And so you attempt to imagine. Sometimes you fall short or you fail. But I do enjoy the imagining. So, you know, as opposed to, oh, I know that, so let me write it. No, I need to imagine it. Let me imagine it and then write it. In terms of what I learned, you know, a big thing I learned, because my characters are so difficult, or readers, I think, will find them difficult. I have much love for these women, and respect and compassion. I think that's the most important thing. With the attempt, like, to learn compassion and to understand that we're all flawed. We all have some kind of past. We're hurt. We're wounded. And so you know, you meet that nasty woman or that nasty old woman in the queue, you know, or whatever, an old grumpy man or whatever, or young people who are being mean. And often we just have that moment to understand them, and we don't have all the time before, and what formed them. So yeah.
Okay. I think just to answer your question in terms of what I learned as well, my character, one of the things that she does for her birthday is she tries to do something new. So we meet her at a particular point where she decides she's going to have a tattoo. So I think as I've been observing older women, you know, as I grow older, one of the things that I want to do as much as possible is to remain open and to constantly want to learn. I don't, if I can, I don't want to be one of these older people that's like, oh, you know, in my day we didn't do this, and, you know, what is all this technology thing? And I met a 97-year-old woman the other day, and she says, I'll give you my email address to stay in touch. You know, and I said, do you check your email? And she said, of course I do. You know, and she probably has Snapchat and whatever, and, you know, she's probably ahead of me. So, you know, so for me that was something that was very striking. And I don't want to idealize old age. You know, people, my character doesn't have a mental, you know, she's not suffering from dementia. She's physically quite fit until she has the fall. So there are all sorts of things that can make old age very difficult. But I do like that openness of spirit, and I hope that as I grow older, that's something I'll hold on to.
Yes, please, in the front row.
My name is Dada Olanikbekun. I enjoyed your spoken words. But I want to find out from you, you are married to a Yoruba man. There's what we call Ijala Areode. Can you recite in spoken words your Ijala Areode? That's the first one. Secondly, I want to find out from you. You are married to Ladipo Mayinka. What kind of culture shock did you have before you got married to him? And after that, is there any possibility of relating those culture shock in your other works?
So let me say, Ladipo is my maiden name, which I held on to when I married. My husband is he's not from here, he's from Zimbabwe. So I see myself as, I know people like to change the Manyika to Manyinka, you know, to make it Yoruba, but it's not, it's Manyika, which is Shona. So I very much see myself as very Pan-African. I lived in Kenya, so, you know, big up to Kenya here. So West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. Je parle français, alors j'ai ça aussi. So I really see myself as, you know, Pan-African. I don't know if it was a question or a rebuke as to reciting Yoruba. You know, I'm very willing to be a student. I'm very sad that I don't speak Yoruba. I grew up in Lagos for the first few years of my life, and then we moved to Jos, and I don't speak Hausa anymore, so I'm just pretty useless, actually.
Okay, another question here, please.
So I don't have a question. I just really want to thank the two of you for, and also Evaristo, for Mr. Loverman, for concentrating on the older folks. I'm just really touched by the three. She's not here, but thanks to her.
Thank you.
And I want to say to Yewande especially, you have a penchant for difficult characters, and thank you. Never stop that, because, you know, nasty people, well, they deserve their humanity as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Kina. Thank you. A question, Chinelo, please. Just there.
Hi, my name is Chinelo Nwalu. The question I had for both of you is, you both have characters of color in your books, living in predominantly in white supremacist societies, or societies dominated by white supremacy and white, how would I put it, dominated societies. How does race play a part in the stories that you're telling? How does it shape the characters? How does it influence what they decide to do or what they don't decide to do? And how, in particular, how does it shape the way they age?
Well, okay. So I have a PhD looking at race, and I've written about race a lot, so it's hard for me to be very quick, but I will try and be quick and say, my character lives in San Francisco. San Francisco is a bubble. There are many bubbles in America. We've seen that with the election result, okay? So, which is not to say that race doesn't come into play in San Francisco. I have a 17-year-old black son, so I think about this a lot, yeah? But I think not only is there the question of race, there's a question of socioeconomics. And so this is something that my character touches on. My character drives a very fancy car, and she's stopped by the police and so forth. But kind of what happens to her is not necessarily what might happen to someone in the hood. So it's complicated, and I attempt to at least try and get to some of the complications of the reality of living as a black person in America, which is complex and very nuanced.
I mean, similar answer, just the complexity of race. And I think what I wanted to do was not flatten this debate, but in terms of the setting of the story, similar to what you're saying, these two women are living in a gated community, which is this thing that's definitely very prevalent in South Africa. These gated communities that are all about steeling yourself against the onslaught of crime, but really of black people with no money, essentially. So an invisible kind of part of a non-human character in the story, I would say, is the setting of Catherine, and also the history. The other aspect of the story that has to do with race is the layered history that Cape Town has, and the fact that we don't talk about the history of slavery in Cape Town. So Cape Town is the postcard, it's really beautiful, it's got Table Mountain, it's got the sea, but nobody deals, and it's got the wine, but we don't deal with the slaves who worked those lands, of these vines. And so I go a bit into, very subtly, but I go a bit into that history. So the race comes through there as well, historically.
Okay, just one last question. Here in the front, please.
Thank you. My name is Ola Williams. I want us to look a little bit about nature. I've not read either of you, but I'm fascinated about your African roots and the fact that you are talking about women, mothers, the concept of the earth as a mother. I don't know if either of you could reflect on that, and if it's something you have written about or you have thoughts you can share with us on. The concept of the earth as a mother, and the mother of us all, good children, bad children, and the whole lot of that. Could you please?
Well, I think the notion of Mother Earth is a nice metaphor. One of the things as a writer is that, I'll speak for myself, I don't know about you, Wande. We write because that's the medium that we feel most comfortable in. So sometimes when you're on stage and someone throws you a question, you're like, just give me a few days, and then I'll come up with a beautiful something on Mother Earth. So.
Okay, we've literally got 1 minute. Has anyone got any more burning questions? Okay, one very last one here, and then we'll round up, please. Just in the middle at the back.
My name is Kwame. It's not actually a question. I am grateful that, So I had an encounter with my 97-year-old grandmom, and I couldn't imagine she was that old. So I asked, having lived all these years, has she ever tried smoking marijuana? And she nearly died. I mean, she was so surprised, and she asked why I would expect that of her. And the reason I asked was because she is so up to date. She is very sane. She is aware. She does everything by herself. But to have lived so long and not, I mean, to miss out on, some of these things. So for me to hear you assume characters that are in that light, not that they smoked, but for me it is quite appreciable, and I'm grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to say?
They're characters in their 40s who've never tried marijuana, so, but she should go for it, I think. You can do whatever you want when you get to that age.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll round up. Thank you very much to Sarah and to Yewande. Thank you.